All right, thanks very much. Such a nice crowd. I'm gonna have to go over there to click the buttons, so I won't be able to see some of you in the back there, but still shout out your questions when the time comes. It's great to be back here at Stanford, and there's something poignant, nice to be with a Stanford PhD student, because 3 decades ago, I was a Stanford PhD student, and I came here to study democratization in Hungary with Philippe Schmitter. But then I got sidetracked because I thought, oh, they became a democracy. That's all done, right? Nothing interesting there. So I decided to study the EU, law and politics of the EU, because that's where East Central European countries were heading, et cetera. And then it all kind of came full circle. So let's talk a little bit. Now, I was going to give a different talk, but we decided to adjust it because of what happened last week. So this is kind of off the cuff. About the Hungarian election and relating it to some broader work I've been doing. I'm going to try to answer 20 minutes or so, kind of explore 3 questions. First, just a little background. How was Orban able to build this electoral autocracy? And how was he able to do it inside the EU, which is supposed to be a union of democracies, right? Why did the EU allow this to happen, right? Second, what caused his autocracy to fall? How could Peter Magyar defeat him, right? And then finally, what does this all mean for Hungary, the EU, Putin and Trump, and the kind of global battle of democracy versus autocracy? And I won't say too much about the domestic side of it. I'll touch on it, but that's going to be more in Hanna's talk. Okay, so first, how could he do this? I mean, we could have the whole session on this, but I'll just make it quick. In terms of the techniques Orban used, he used what a lot of people call the kind of standard electoral autocrats playbook. He won a free and fair election. He'd been in power before. Hi, Chloe. But in 2010, when he came into power, he won a free and fair election. And because of scandals in the previous regime and the nature of the electoral system, he got a 2/3 majority. And with that, he was able to amend the Constitution. And he took that power. And having been in power once before and lost office, he didn't like that. So he said, how am I going to make sure I can cement my hold on power and stay in office for many years to come? And he followed the playbook. He captured the referees. First, the court system. He lowered the retirement age for judges to get rid of about 40% of the judiciary, did other tricks like that for various bodies of the state that were supposed to be independent. He used his constitutional majority to basically entrench party loyalists in these positions. And this becomes very important today, because he did it in a way that you would need a 2/3 majority to undo, which now Peter Magyar has, right? But anyway, so he took over all the kind of ombudsman's office, prosecutors, all the things that were supposed to be independent, and put them under his party's control. He attacked and seized control of the state-run media, and then through his oligarchs, most of the private media. So in the end, he had about 80% control of Hungarian media, right? And turned those into propaganda arms for the government. Okay? He demonized and undermined the opposition for years using various stratagems, penalizing parties with kind of bogus fines, using the state-run media to demonize them, et cetera. And until this recent wave and what Peter Magyar did, he succeeded in a kind of divide et impera strategy, kept them divided. He even helped create fake parties to splinter the opposition, lots of things like that. He also then changed the electoral rules a couple times in ways designed to advantage his party. I was just talking to Larry about this a minute ago. There was a sweet irony in what happened last week, because in the end, some of those tweaks to the electoral system backfired against him this time. But anyway, he changed the rules of the game, and then he won. Let's be clear, because a lot of people say, oh, well, Hungary was a democracy, they had elections. But even the OSCE in the last 3 elections, when they monitored, they said the elections were free but unfair. So these were not fair elections. The playing field was heavily tilted, but it was, let's call it, free enough that he could still plausibly claim a facade of democracy. And there you go. That was how he cemented his kind of electoral autocracy. But for me, what my research has been on recent years, kind of the more interesting angle to me, was that happens in lots of places in the world. But how did this happen inside the EU, right? Where you're supposed to be a union of democracies. Right there, Article 2 of the treaties says it's a union founded on democracy. I mean, for goodness sake, they won the Nobel Prize, the EU, in 2012, partly for contributing to democracy in Europe. So how did the EU allow this to happen? Okay, well, I just want to say, in short, when I started thinking about this question, I remembered stuff I had studied in grad school here at Stanford, nothing to do with the EU, more about like Latin America and different parts of the world, this phenomena of regime juxtaposition, or this idea that sometimes you have regimes which are democratic on a national level, but have little pockets of autocracy within them, right? And I thought about that literature and went back and started reading it, and I said, aha, well, that's basically what's going on in the EU, right? And there's a few key factors that lead a democratic union like the EU to not only tolerate, but in a way be an incubator for, supporter for little sort of enclaves of autocracy, okay? First one is party politics. We had it here in the US, right? In the US South for about 80 years after the Civil War. We had one-party autocratic regimes in the US South, right? When we were supposed to be this great democracy. How did that happen? Well, because basically these racist autocracies run by the Democratic Party contributed seats in Congress to the Democrats and helped them elect presidents with the Electoral College. So the Democratic Party protected them and allowed them to have one-party autocratic systems in the South as long as they helped the National Party. Okay, what does this have to do with the EU? Well, the same thing happened in the EU, right? With the EPP. Right there, you have the leader of the free world, but she had a dirty little secret, which wasn't so secret, that she was the #1 defender and protector of Viktor Orban. I will challenge you to look through the record and ever find Angela Merkel saying a negative word about Viktor Orban. You won't, because she systematically prevented the EU from acting against him. Why? Largely because his party, Fidesz, was, until a couple of years ago, a member of her Euro party, because there's pan-European party politics in the European Parliament and the Council. And her Euro party, the European People's Party, which was the center-right Christian Democrats party, had as their little pet autocrat Orban, right? And so his party was in there. You know how J.D. Vance was campaigning last week? Well, guess who used to campaign in Budapest for Orban? Manfred Weber, this who's still the leader of the EPP in the European Parliament, right? That's him in 2018, campaigning for Orban, right? So the Orban had the protection of the biggest party in Europe, the center-right, and I mean, they had other reasons. And by the way, lots of other Euro parties have like pet autocrats, or have had till recently. We can talk more about that, but let me focus on Hungary. There's other reasons. We'll get to the car industry in a second. But second reason the EU allowed this to happen and even encouraged it. I mean, the EU says it's a promoter of democracy, but I'm a total Europhile. I have an EU flag in my office. I love the EU. But let's be honest. The EU became the biggest funder of autocratization in the world. The two fastest autocratizing countries, according to VDEM in the 2010s in the world, were Poland and Hungary. What do they have in common? Both EU member states who received huge subsidies from the EU. So the EU was financing this, right? And what happens, and this happened in the US too, like with the southern states historically, is you guys all know the resource curse and how money flowing into an autocratic government can help it, support a patronage network and all those things. Well, in the EU, it wasn't oil revenue, it was EU funding, right? So the EU poured money into Hungary. Orban, I mean, he was kind of generous in a way because he only stole like 20% of it for himself, right? The rest he used to prop up his patronage network, right? And the Fidesz mafia state, right? All with EU funding, okay? Hungary was the biggest recipient of EU funds on a per capita basis, in this period. Okay, I got to go faster. That's all right. So yeah, and this was not like a well-kept secret, newspaper headlines, how Viktor Orban taps Europe's taxpayers to bankroll his family and friends, etc. This was well known, okay? The richest guy in Hungary was a gas pipe fitter until a few years ago, who has the one attribute of having gone to kindergarten with Orban in the same village, and they're like best pals. Because Orban couldn't officially be the richest guy in the country. That would really look bad, right? So he had to have a bag man, and that's his friend, but basically, and his son-in-law, his dad, everyone's getting construction contracts funded by the EU. Okay, I got to skip that one. That's fun. And then also, I sometimes say Hungary's not an autocracy, or wasn't. It was an Audiocracy, because the biggest foreign direct investor in Hungary is Audi. But BMW's also got its hands in this. That was part of the reason Merkel was tolerating all this, besides the party politics, is basically there was a lot of German FDI, all the car factories were moving there, Orban treated them well. And basically by being an EU member state and having access to the single market, he made Hungary attractive for investment. And that was part of what sustained the regime too. Okay, and last thing I'll mention, the other factor I think contributed to this is emigration, not immigration, but emigration, right? That basically, and this is an insight from Hirschman, that if you have a kind of pressure release valve, if people can leave an autocracy, it can help that autocracy survive. That happened in the US with the Great Migration of African Americans moving to the Midwest and the Northeast. That kind of helped Southern autocracies survive without exploding, right? And basically, same thing was happening in Hungary, Bulgaria too, places like that. In an article I did about 10 years ago, I looked at percent change in EU citizens living in another member state. This is from 2010 to 18, the first 8 years of Orban. That's Hungary there, right? Basically, young Hungarians, they didn't all come to Stanford for their PhD. A lot of them just went to Germany or Austria to get a job, right? But basically, that helped the Orban regime survive. 500,000 or so people leaving, going to other EU member states, and then making it very hard for them to vote back at home. Okay, I guess a couple other things, just that contribute to this. I'll say quickly before I go to the next parts of the talk. Some things made this problem even worse in the EU and made the EU more reluctant. There's kind of intergovernmental norms of not interfering in domestic politics. There's some of that, but also big issues like foreign policy on Russia or the EU budget. Those require unanimous voting. And so Hungary was able to wield its veto threat often to kind of extort the EU. Don't crack down on me or else I'll veto your budget. I'll veto your aid to Russia and stuff. So that is, even more so than in a normal federal country. The EU has this veto power for individual states. So that made the EU also reluctant to intervene. And I would just finally add, before we go to the next part, the EU provided unparalleled infiltration opportunities. I mean, this, by which I mean, Orban's little autocracy didn't just stay in the small country of Hungary. It penetrated Brussels, right? And tried to poison the EU. He had the insight, you don't want to do Brexit. You don't want to leave the EU. You should stay in, get the money, and infiltrate the capital, right? And so my favorite example of that is when von der Leyen needed Orban's support to become Commission president, right? In the European Parliament, he said, okay, give me control of EU enlargement policy. So he put his guy, right, in charge of EU enlargement policy, Oliver Vadhe, and basically that meant that for that 5 years of von der Leyen's first term, EU enlargement policy was a total joke. And they just issue these reports saying everything is great in Serbia, rule of law, it's like that, because Vadhe was trying to defend, pet autocrats of Orban's in neighboring countries. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to make it 5 more minutes. What caused Orban to fall? I think Hanna's going to talk about some of this. I'll just make a couple quick points. The one thing I want to say is we have to be careful not to draw the wrong lessons about why he fell. I about had a fit the other day when the Frankfurter Allgemeine, which is the main center-right newspaper in Germany, ran a headline day after the election, what the EU can learn from Hungary. And they said, it shows that democracy works and doesn't need moral finger wagging from Brussels. Okay, that's like 100% the wrong lesson, 100%. But of course, German Christian Democrats would say that, right? Because they don't want to remember what they did, right? Really what happened, I think the EU side, there's a domestic side, Peter Magyar and all the things he did, but there's an international side to why Orban fell. Finally, we can go into details, but finally Fidesz got kicked out of the European People's Party, 2021, okay, because he basically took it too far. He said Manfred Weber was a concentration camp guard, different things or whatever. He was getting embarrassing. They finally kicked him out of the party. So he lost his big protection, okay? Merkel, his protector, left office 2022, right? So he lost Muti, right? Basically he kept pushing things too far. It was okay when he attacked migrants. No one really wanted to care. But when he attacked LGBTQ community, then EU member states started getting mad. So this is a little too much, right? That's a group that we care more about. And also he started, all the pro-Russia policy, blocking policy on Ukraine. That became too much. So, he was pushing things too far, right? the EU kind of ran out of excuses. They had made all these excuses for years. We need more tools to deal with this issue, blah, blah, blah. By then, they had all the tools they had ever said they needed. And the European Court of Justice said, yeah, it's fine to suspend money, et cetera. So they finally act 2022. They finally start suspending money. I was a little bit involved with this. It's like probably the only relevant thing I've done outside of academia recent years, like with Kim Shepala and my friend John Marine. We wrote reports for the European Parliament, working with basically all the rapporteurs of the different parties on the rule of law file, kind of making the legal case of why the EU would be justified to suspend Hungary's funding. Okay. And anyway, finally the Commission did this 2022. And yeah, basically they suspended about 32 billion to Hungary. Orban got 10 billion back when you guys remember that thing where he basically extorted the EU for 10 billion? He said, well, I'll go to the bathroom, right? And so that I don't have to vote for this, but I won't veto it. He went for a few minutes to the bathroom. Then they voted for Ukrainian accession to open, and then they gave him 10 billion euros. Okay. But anyway, but what I want to say, back to the point of don't learn the wrong lessons, is that this suspension of money worked. Okay. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it definitely was effective. It helped. Because if you look at, I think basically, Hanna will talk more about this. I want to hear your views. But I think Hungarians knew that the regime was corrupt and things like that. But as long as their lives were getting better, a lot of them would kind of tolerate it, go along with it. But in the last few years, a bunch of things happened. GDP growth stalled. Hungarian economy has been flat because it was fed so much by EU money before. When that dried up, that hurt. Real wage growth in 23 and 24 collapsed. Hungarians' living standards were getting worse, right? And so people felt it. And that was right at the timing when there was also this kind of child sex abuse scandal came out about Fidesz. Péter Magyar stepped in with his big video denouncing corruption, but it was all at a moment when people's lives were getting worse too. And that helped, I think, build the momentum for his party. Okay. Yeah. So Hungary just loses this money. Public services are deteriorating because of this, hospitals falling apart, schools, etc. And, I think the thing I'm sure Hanna will talk about, the other key to why he fell, it was that pressure from outside, the economic repercussions, but also that you had a viable opposition that united all opposition forces under a charismatic leader, and we'll talk more about that. So you needed that. Okay, finally, in my last minute, what does the fall of Orban mean for Hungary, for the EU, Putin, Trump, all those questions? I'll be very quick and we can get to this in the Q&A. Okay? I mean, for Hungary, it basically means regime change. And Magyar has said that. This isn't just a change in government. It's a change in regime. We're going to tear down the mafia state, the kleptocracy Orban had built, and try to restore democracy. For the EU, what does it mean? Well, it means that policy on Ukraine and Russia will be much smoother because Orban had been wielding a veto and then extorting concessions whenever he did, finally give in and allow things to go forward. But he was trying to water down sanctions on Russia, undermine aid to Ukraine. So that'll be gone, right? And I think, I'm not saying Magyar will become the biggest supporter of Ukraine. He won't, but he won't veto things in that, okay? What does it mean for the U.S.? What does it mean for the U.S. and Russia? Well, the Kremlin lost its Trojan horse in the council. You guys all saw this thing a few weeks ago. Was not really a secret, but there were new revelations that Péter Szijjártó, which is the Hungarian foreign minister, was calling Lavrov, right, giving him secrets right after the meetings, all that. So basically, the EU is trying to have a common foreign policy when they have a Russian agent at the table voting and listening, right? So that's gone. And also, Trump administration lost their number one ally in Europe, both ideologically and politically, in terms of trying to undermine the EU, support MAGA worldview, et cetera. And then the last thing I'll say, just on that kind of global battle sort of thing, Orban was a key figure in trying to bring together far-right populists in Europe. When he got kicked out of the EPP, he helped form a new Euro party, the Patriots. They had this conference last year about MEGA, Make Europe Great Again, right? And like you see, it's like all the cast of characters, Le Pen, Wilders, Orban. He was trying to bring those people together. So I think what it means is this incredible victory for the Hungarian people and democracy it pierces the kind of shield of invincibility, shows that even in a heavily rigged system, a united opposition can win. And Orban, even though it's a small country, he was the kind of role model for these guys. Like, this is what you can do. This is how you can consolidate your rule. And a lot of other wannabe autocrats, had his model in mind. Trump hoped to do that in the US, and people like Fico want to do it in Slovakia, all over. So now they've lost their role model, and they're one of their key leaders. So I think it's a very hopeful day for democracy, and I'll hand it over now.
Now it's green. So, okay. Awesome, perfect. So yes, after a great overview of the European and international angle, I will talk about the domestic. So I will try to give sort of a around 20-minute summary as well to what brought this, Fidesz's defeat after 16 years in Hungary. And I will be somewhat sort of brief about certain factors, and I will especially focus on what the TISA party did right to get us here. So the key facts, Fidesz, as we know, but was defeated in a crushing defeat with a record turnout at almost 80%. You can see the sort of Fidesz's vote share in the past, I guess, 16 years in elections, and you can see how it dominated with the orange line there, the opposition before in every election until it performed significantly worse now against the TISA party. So regarding the TISA party, is headed by, as we know, Péter Magyar. He was a mid-level Fidesz elite, the ex-husband of the former justice minister. One important thing here is that he was like highly proximate to power, but he was completely unknown for people outside of Fidesz. I think we can say this with a pretty good confidence. A lot of the political pundits and experts, right after he sort of came out with his video denouncing corruption in Fidesz, explicitly said they didn't know who he was. He was close to power, but he was not publicly well known. Okay, so that changed 2 years ago when there was this pardon scandal. Basically, the scandal was that the Hungarian president, in collaboration with the justice minister, then the ex-wife, pardoned the someone who aided in covering up a sexual abuse scandal in a children's home by the director of the children's home. Péter Magyar, at this point, went public with an explosive video denouncing corruption in Fidesz, the first high-profile person from Fidesz to do this. It received a lot of attention. He organized a series of protests and then basically founded a party that received just a couple of months later 30% of the votes in the European Parliament elections. And then the same party, less than 2 years later, secured 2/3 of the seats in parliament in this election. This is him in this first video in his when he went public in 2024, and then this is sort of what the electoral map looked like with TISA in blue. You can see how much the party dominated. So this all happened, as we have sort of talked about, in a system that was absolutely stacked against opposition parties. Fidesz, as we said, rewrote electoral rules to favor itself very strongly, basically creating an electoral system that favors large parties with a rural base. That was Fidesz up until recently. There's also, this is kind of my research, so I put it there, but it's a huge problem for parties. Strong intimidation of politicians and activists with that where Fidesz used its control over jobs and the portion of businesses that were linked to opposition actors. There was extensive vote buying and voter intimidation in Hungary, in Hungary's poorest communities. And Fidesz also benefited from ethnic Hungarians' votes in neighboring countries. And this in total brings Fidesz roughly an estimated 500,000 votes. And this is in a country where in this previous election, 6.5 million people voted. So it's an incredibly significant advantage. Fidesz, as we said, also controls 80% of the media market with strong pro-Fidesz propaganda and anti-opposition content. And of course, there's exceedingly unequal party financing and a whole host of other difficulties. So how did this happen? In a way, it was a constellation of a lot of factors, but there are important recipes for success for oppositions there. For one, there was broad discontent due to economic woes and corruption, as we have also talked about just a few minutes ago. Discredited established opposition parties couldn't capitalize on this, so this sort of discontent was brewing for a while. And there were these scandals around Fidesz. And TISA arrives at this opportune moment where all of these there was a great demand for a real opposition alternative, but that of course wouldn't have been enough. It also successfully built a broad coalition, I will argue, through extensive ground level campaigning across the country, messaging on competent economic governance and anti-corruption that resonated very much with a broad set of voters, and also reclaiming patriotism for the opposition from the sort of far-right populist incumbents. And this, in the end, brought this like absolutely resounding victory from sort of all parts of the country and all parts of voters that acted like a popular front against the Orbán regime. So I will be pretty brief on these demand-side factors. As Dan already mentioned, the economy is stagnating, the loss of EU funds and the absolute mismanagement of the economy by the Orbán regime brought that. There was also this real decline in the power of wages. Hungary had the absolute record inflation in the EU for like 2 years. And for both 2022 and 2023, it was, I think, 16 and 17, almost 16 and 17% respectively for the whole year. Food prices, inflation food prices was 50% for like half a year. So Hungarians, like across the board, said that their wages were worth much less than before. And there was also this extreme corruption. There are so many stories we could talk about here. This one is the Orbán family's country manor at Hatvanpuszta, close to where Orbán was born. This is an incredibly lavish manor that they built for themselves. This is officially owned by Orbán's father. And as Dan already said, like people knew this, people knew about the corruption, but when like living standards started to decline, people just felt that, well, we are struggling while they get rich on our money. It kind of became the much more heightened issue. So some of these issues were already present in 2022. Inflation was already very high. The economy was not doing well. And opposition parties, however, could not capitalize on this. They'd received Fidesz delivered a crushing defeat for them, for the opposition coalition in the 2022 election. And even then, though, this disconnect wasn't as high as in 2026, many voted for Fidesz because they did not see an alternative. Here is just a figure based on research from the Stanford University team that basically just asked people why they voted for Fidesz. And even back then, around 10% of Fidesz voters said they did so because they did not see an alternative. And the most popular response was material reasons. So the opposition couldn't convince voters that they could live better under them than they did under Fidesz. Of course, this is when sort of TISA entered the scene. And while it was like an especially opportune moment, Péter Magyar was in a way in the right place at the right time. He and his party also carried out an exemplary campaign over the last 2 years. And I argue that they really focused on building a broad voter coalition. It was different from what existing parties the opposition parties have done before in its scale and rapidity as well. So for one, this had sort of like 4 important strategies in my view. For one, they engaged in extensive underground campaigning across the country, including in rural areas, instead of just focusing on urban opposition strongholds. They also presented concrete economic proposals and anti-corruption measures instead of focusing on ideological issues or just like simple anti-regime messaging, as people have seen from existing parties before. They reclaimed patriotism from the far right in sort of a new version that was different from shying away from nationalism that is often characteristic of opposition that has been in Hungary. And they represented a fresh start for the opposition instead of coordinating with discredited and divisive opposition actors. So I will go through each of these in turn now, starting with this extensive ground level campaign that TISA conducted across the country that built a lot of credibility for the party in both that they wanted to defeat Orbán, but also that they had the sort of organizational capacity and will and skills to govern well if they get into office. This, I think, is by far the biggest innovation that we saw. Péter Magyar conducted these countrywide tours, as he called them. He did sort of 7 total. In these tours for like 30 to 80 days, he went around the country holding 4 to 7 rallies a day in localities of all sizes. He also walked to Transylvania once. That was one of the tours. Here there's just a map of the locations of his rallies just in the first year and a half of his campaign, or like less than a year and a half. And you can already see that he's been across the country. And this is just one person who's been to all these places. And imagine meeting the prospective prime minister, a contender for the prime minister in your like town of 1,000 or like village of 1,000 people. And maybe, and if you live in a place of 15 to 20,000 residents, he's probably been there in the past 2 years, not even once, but 2 or 3 or 4 times. So I wanted to show you what these look like. So these are all photos from me. So I went to these rallies in southwestern Hungary in December 2024, because I wanted to do some fieldwork for my research and as well as see for myself what these look like. And that was very sort of some of the earlier days comparatively. All of these rallies kind of followed similar schemes. These were all in one day of like places of different sizes. This bottom one here was just a village of 800 people. And the other middle one was, I think, 1,500 people, technically a town in Hungary. And in each of these places, he sort of speaks to people. He spoke to people for around 40 to 50 minutes, covering very much the same, like similar topics, talking about how the Orbán regime has let Hungarians down through sort of both missed opportunities for economic growth and prosperity, corruption, etc., and other abuses of power. And then talked about the visions that he and his party had to solve these issues. He took questions as well. And then at the end, you could go up to him and talk to him, take a selfie, shake his hand. And he did this basically delivering a similar speech in each of these places, but always also adjusting them for the key local concerns in each of these like towns or villages. So he was very well prepared. I also went to his rallies just now, this past month, in southeastern Hungary and in central Hungary. So these are from those days that I spent there. The scheme was still similar, of course, even more popular. I'm not very good at photographing crowds, so I will include a big crowd picture after. But he would always walk up. He was very sort of personable. He would walk up. He's always on live on his like social media, so he would tell where he is, but afterwards he would shake hands with everyone as he goes up and greets like he was among the people. Then he would give these same speeches or similar speeches, and people would go up to him after. And again, he connected to sort of like local concerns and local audiences very well. So this is what the crowds actually look like at these. I was not very good at photographing that, but these are places that are not that big. I mean, this one is a town of 30,000, and you can see the incredible crowds that were present. Like in a town of 50,000, in one of these pictures, I went with a journalist friend. We estimated that there were probably like over 1,000, maybe even 2,000 people that went there. And there were rallies held in the same county at 6 different places that day. So in this process, he shook hands and took selfies with possibly like hundreds of thousands of people. People estimate maybe around like 100 to 300,000 people, which is pretty incredible, including me. So that was from December 2024. But yes, so he did this, and then the district candidates did very similar things as well. So that is also very important that for someone to be a district candidate for the electoral district of party, their sort of rule was that you are a contender if you have 1,000 people's phone numbers in your phone from your district, and each candidate was expected to collect 15,000 signatures in support of them from their district. These electoral districts were like roughly around like 50,000 on average, or 40,000, 50,000 people there. So that's a lot of those, a lot of signatures. This man, I also got to shadow him on his campaign last week. That was last Wednesday. And I just wanted to show you the kind of work he was doing. He's a district candidate in southern Hungary, in a district with the most settlements. So there were 174 settlements, primarily small villages, in his electoral district. And he had been to each of them more than twice. And you can see like what that looked like, just a little stall to talk to people who came up. The day I went, we were in a village, for instance, of 250 people. And in total, 10 people came to talk to him. A lot of people were afraid to come to talk to him, by the way, because they were intimidated. At least that's what people there told us. But he just went on, you can see his schedule of the number of sort of places he had been to each day and the amount of effort he was making. He actually ended up winning this district, even though there were huge concerns about vote buying and voter intimidation there. So that was a huge win for TISA as well. And all this was also underpinned by a very strong grassroots network composed of what are called these TISA islands. These were relatively autonomous activist groups that organized community events, door-to-door campaigning, and facilitated rallies by both the candidates and Péter Magyar himself. You can see, for instance, there are some logos from these in the city of Kecskemét. This is from the early days when there were just 7 of them there. There are many more after, but I found this picture just to show that what these sort of look like. And I also got to, last summer, I also got to join one of these TISA islands in their activities in the city of Pécs in southern Hungary. And for instance, I took this picture when these activists held a meeting where they were learning about how to do effective door-to-door campaigning from a marketing specialist that they themselves invited to learn how to do this. So you could see that they took like this initiative and they were sort of taking their job very seriously, and that contributed greatly to the party's success. So the second big important thing that TISA did was that it focused its campaign on promises of competent economic governance and tackling corruption that align very much with broad voter priorities. So this is their program. And in this, they presented extensive welfare proposals. This was pretty similar to the case of Poland, where the opposition parties similarly matched and often exceeded the governing party in their promises when the coalition Galicia defeated the Law and Justice Party 3 years ago. So that was a similar strategy here. You can't promise less. They also really focused on improving public services, healthcare, education, roads, and public infrastructure. Importantly, they really focused on eliminating corruption, and they also linked these together, linked economic prosperity and eliminating corruption together by saying that they will try to reclaim and get back as much of the wealth stolen as possible. And that was very important for voters to hear that, that eliminating corruption can benefit them in that way, even at present. They also focused on democracy restorations, relations with the EU and neighbors. And very importantly, they largely avoided or to some degree even matched Fidesz on the most divisive topics that were out there and issues that Fidesz owns, such as immigration, LGBT rights, or Ukraine's EU accession, just to not alienate Fidesz voters, past Fidesz voters. The third big innovation, I think, was reclaiming patriotism for the opposition that created unity. A lot of times when parties contest these right-wing populist far-right actors, I believe that's one of the core challenges what to do with nationalism being claimed for the far-right. And what TISA's answer to that was creating a new form of patriotism, new form of like positive nationalism in its campaigns. It really focused on reclaiming the use of Hungarian flags. One of Péter Magyar's innovations to use a lot of verses that every Hungarian knows from poems and songs that we've learned in school and incorporated in both sort of like their slogans and speeches, and reference Hungarian historical figures that everyone knows and is aware of and sort of maybe proud to share a nation with. He kind of thought of patriotism as a basis of solidarity and compassion and portrayed it as such. And it was also portrayed and echoed by activists as their motivation for activism with TISA. And you can just see here the amount of Hungarian flags you could see at a TISA rally, which is not what opposition rallies look like in Hungary for the past 16 years. Here was one of their main slogans for the election was now or never. And that with or never crossed out. And that is from one of these Hungarian poems that everyone knows by our maybe main national poet, Sándor Petőfi, that was sort of like anecdotally the poem that started the 1848 revolution in Hungary. And that is him in sort of Hungarian folk wear. And finally, Péter Magyar and TISA distanced themselves from the discredited and divisive established opposition parties, which facilitated this like credibility and unity. They did not coordinate in any way with established opposition parties and politicians that voters were already very done with and ready to move past, and we're very off after the past 16 years. And they, for instance, any past association with established opposition parties barred aspirants from being a candidate for the TISA party. They were very strict on this. So beyond these 4 strategies, first you can see kind of like how TISA's support evolved over time. At the start, a lot of the support originated from very quickly getting all the opposition voters to support TISA. Even in the European Parliament election, the established opposition parties performed terribly. And very soon after TISA's emergence, they started polling in the single digits combined. And then slowly, TISA also reclaimed or sort of wooed over Fidesz voters and voters who had not voted before. This was a pretty sort of steady process, and there was an increase in TISA support in the last 2 or 3 months. Some of this was also coming from kind of few scandals around Fidesz. I wanted to give an overview of this as well, because it mattered a lot for the election and definitely for securing the 2/3 majority for TISA. So Fidesz's key message in the campaign was that sort of like insane. They had this sort of insane misinformation campaign, as you probably know, focused on Ukraine being the greatest threat to Hungary. And their kind of message was that we protect our national sovereignty and peace for Hungarians in the face of these like deadly foreign threats from Ukraine, while TISA are like a pro-Ukraine party of traitors who would drag us into war. One of these was accompanied by a lot of billboards. One of the about portraying TISA's association with Ukraine and Zelensky and being dangerous for Hungarians. This one was coming from also a comic book that Fidesz basically published informally through its like affiliates called Me the Two-Faced. So that's Peter Magyar being two-faced, pro-EU and Ukraine, and pretending to be pro-Hungary. But this was it didn't resonate with a lot of voters, but it was also discredited. There was mounting evidence that Fidesz worked for their own interests and foreign interests. There was this link to Russia that has been mentioned in this talk, and also that I'm sure you know about, where it came out that Fidesz works very closely with Russia within the EU and in various ways. So that is Orban and Putin and being very good friends. But also there were these 2 very important like scandals that actually were reverberated much more in Hungary than these Russia links in the last few weeks. And they kind of didn't get a lot of attention in international media, maybe because they were a little complicated to understand, to sort of like cover. The first one was this this video with Bence Szabó. He's a captain in the police, a police detective. He basically went public with information that the Hungarian intelligence services were working to take down TISA as a party. He got this information because he worked as a detective, and he was asked to sort of receive the tip-off, later confirmed that it was from the intelligence services, to investigate the IT professionals of TISA for having child pornography materials. And when he sort of got there and they started investigating, it turned out that these, so he saw that these IT specialists had been the subject of like a month-long sort of like plan or project to intimidate them, try to woo them over to Fidesz by these little agents that were trying to, basically their goal was to take down the IT system of the party. So he saw this, and then he ended up going public with this information, this video that was viewed by 2 million times in the first like day and a half. There was another similarly explosive video from a Hungarian military captain, Pálinkai Szilveszter. He was actually the face of the Hungarian military. He went public talking about the incredibly dire state of the Hungarian military and the level of sort of like unprofessionalism and dissatisfaction in the military, and also with a story with information about some insane military mission that Orban's son was planning in Chad, because it was so basic, because it was revealed to him, he thinks by Jesus in a dream that he should go protect the Christians in Chad. So despite having no military experience, he's been planning this mission within the military, with an office right next to the head of the Hungarian military, where he expected Hungarian soldiers to have there to be a 50% fatality rate that he thought was important to protect Christians in Chad. This mission was sort of postponed for after the election, but just like this information that obviously this is the evidence of like this kind of corruption that this was possible, but also that Fidesz's like message of being for peace was not credible at all. This was also very heavily used in the last weeks of Magyar's campaign. I also took this photo in one of his rallies. He's holding up a sign saying "hero" with Bence Szabó's face, the face of the detective captain. So these events were already showing there was an unprecedented level of political interest at this time in the last few weeks in Hungary, and so unity on the opposition side. There was another important video about vote buying. I'd recommend this to everyone. That called "Price of a Vote." I was documenting vote buying and intimidation in Hungary's poorest in the poorest places in Hungary. And there was a film about Tisza's rise that was streamed 3.3 million times within 2 days. There were 6.5 million people voted in this election. This was over Easter weekend. I watched it with my mom and dad. So that's already 3 watches for one stream. So you could see that likely way more than half of voters actually saw this video. So this film before casting their vote. So very briefly, why did people support Tisza? In my interviews in these countrywide rallies, importantly, these are outside Budapest. I did 38 these mini interviews just these past weeks. And I wanted to sketch that people overwhelmingly said that there is a need for change. And the biggest problem is the economy and Fidesz's corruption and lies. And you could see that this sentiment was absolutely shared across the country. I wanted to show you that this was the map of votes in the 2022 election. Orange colored, where Fidesz received more than 50% of votes. So more than 50% of those who cast votes voted for Fidesz in sort of most of the country, except for the biggest cities. And then here I showed Fidesz's and Tisza's vote share by locality size in 2026. Fidesz didn't get an average of 50% anywhere. And it only got more votes than Tisza in places with less than 1,000 eligible voters. So this was a massive shift across the country towards the opposition, not driven by Budapest. In Budapest, Tisza got 63% of the vote. So cities with above 50,000 voted for Tisza at similar shares in Budapest, which is kind of unprecedented in Hungary, where opposition support was always much stronger in Budapest than anywhere else. This was also driven very much by young people. 87% of young people were planning to vote, which is sort of unheard of, as the young people are the least mobilized very often to vote in elections, and overwhelmingly for Tisza. With Fidesz only being more popular in the plus 65 plus group. So this is most of what I wanted to say. I also wanted to share the top 5 incorrect takes I've seen in international news. I actually run it by a couple of my friends who are journalists, and they agreed. So the first one is that Orban's Hungary wasn't so authoritarian after all. Daniel has also mentioned this to us. The second one is that J.D. Vance's visit made a difference. Unfortunately, Hungarian voters didn't care about it. The third one is that it was all about Russia. This was in The Economist the other day. That was not the case. Hungarian voters were most concerned with the economy and corruption. The third one is that it was all because the Budapest youth mobilized. We've seen all these videos of people in Budapest being extremely happy, but as I said before, it was not Budapest where the biggest difference came from. And the last one is that things won't get better. Well, I'm hopeful here too, so that's why I put it there. But Péter Magyar does seem committed to fundamental democratic change, and there's some pressures from the EU. We will see where it goes. Hungarians are somewhat concerned about this, but also now everyone is so happy that for the next few days, you don't talk about this very much. And I just put a Wall Street Journal opinion piece there that said everyone they are expecting apologies from all the pundits and politicians who predicted that Orban would destroy democracy in Hungary, which I thought was kind of was not the right take. And finally, what are the lessons for democratic resistance against autocratization? Of course, this is something that people will study in the election in great detail. The election just happened a few days ago, but from what I see from TISA's campaign, it's important to connect with voters and build credibility by campaigning a lot and across the country, including in rural constituencies, even if those are your opponent's greatest strongholds. It's important to present a vision for a better future with concrete proposals rooted in citizens' core concerns. That's often the economy and corruption. It proved important to unify, for instance, by reclaiming patriotism from the far right. And it's important to discard or maintain distance from divisive opposition actors and parties. So thank you for your attention.
Our procedure is that you make eye contact, subtly raise your hand like Larry Diamond is demonstrating, and I will keep a list and call on you. And let me warn you that I have to teach at 1:30, so we'll be ending at 1:15 sharp. So Larry Diamond, you happen to be sitting next to me. How strange. Yeah, we're weird.
Can I ask about the things won't change conclusion and skip ahead to the agenda for the restoration of democracy? And specifically, we've heard very little about what Magyar and his party intend to do to restore democracy. What's the role of lustration and purging the Orban elite? What constitutional changes does he have in mind? And I'll just refer back to your advisor, Daniel Philippe Schmitter. He talked a lot in the transitions literature about underutilizing power. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, you could argue they now need to utilize power intensively to create an institutional structure where future governments will underutilize power, in part because no party can ever again win 2/3 of the seats with 54% of the vote. It'd be very easy to put in a fully PR system to do that. So what are they planning?
So maybe I can start with a concrete plan. So this is interesting and important question. One of Péter Magyar's key pledges in the election was to have an 8-year term limit for prime ministers that would act retroactively. So keeping Orban out of power, but anyone else who wants to sort of be prime minister for more than 8 years. It's kind of a strange institutional rule because normally term limits apply to presidents, but Hungary has become quasi-presidential under Orban, one could argue. He also said that there will be a new constitution that will be voted on in a referendum. There is sort of, there are plans of removing the top prosecutor, the head of, so what various heads of these institutions in the state institutions that have been controlled by Fidesz. And he has 2/3 majority, which will make this possible. He's also called on the president to resign. That will not be possible for him to enforce that, but he can suspend, TISA can suspend the president if needed. I think a lot of the changes that will be, and there's the media that he said he will temporarily shut down the public media until it can become an impartial news source. I think there are a lot of questions on what the constitutional changes will include. That is a little less, more vague at the moment. They said that they will consult people and experts. I think the core concern, I agree, is whether the system will stay so extremely majoritarian and unbalanced. And I think it might be hard to sort of force a party to tie their own hands. And this is what people talk about when they are a bit concerned on what those changes will look like.
You want to comment?
I guess I would just add, I think Hanna covered most of it, but yeah, from what we've seen in the last couple of days and what he said in the campaign, I don't think there's any sign Magyar intends to underutilize power. I think quite the opposite. He's not going to be Merrick Garland wringing his hands. He's come to clean house, right? And yeah, like calling on the president to resign. He said, you have no legitimacy to be the symbol of the Hungarian people. You should get out now. And I think he's sending the signal that, as I said before, they captured all these offices, the prosecutor. He's saying this is a regime change, everyone out. And yeah, I think the one danger for Hungary right now is that there isn't really a democratic opposition in parliament, right? You just have TISA, you have Fidesz, which is not a democratically oriented party, and then you have Mihazank, Nazis, right? And so eventually you'll need sort of a normal democratic opposition with multiple parties. But for now, it's good that TISA has the 2/3 because that allows them to get rid of Orban's system.
Eric, is it a real two-finger?
It's a real two-finger.
Okay.
Just to elaborate a bit on the president and getting the president out of power to avoid the Poland problem, what might he do?
Well, yeah, I want to hear about this suspension idea. He can't like remove him from office. He's trying. I think what he's trying to do, it's a sort of, I don't know, shouldn't use this expression anymore, shock and awe. I don't know. He's trying to sort of scare the Fidesz people, saying everyone out. This is a regime change. You know, he's hoping the guy will just step aside. I don't think he can make him leave. So I assume but when they write a new constitution, right, they can basically reform all these offices and, disempower them, et cetera. So I think he's in a very good position to basically root out the Orban influence.
Yes, I basically agree with that. There is the suspension is just what a 2/3 majority in parliament can do in Hungary, but that will effectively, the president is not expected to be, when it's not as powerful as in Poland, not expected to be that sort of like obstacle to these reforms.
Yeah.
All right, so here's my list. Anna, you're next. Christoph, Oren, and Maria on deck. Then I've got Iveta, Hector, this gentleman whose name I don't know. Then we come to Jim over here and there. Yes, exactly. Okay, if I missed anyone, I apologize. Just put your hand up again. Okay, Anna, go for it.
I just have a quick question for both of you, which is about learning, right? What has the EU learned from all this? And what has TISA learned? Like, where did it get, actually, it's a slightly different question. Where did they get the resources to be able to run this incredibly intensive campaign? So question.
Well, Hanna might be able to say more about the resources. Let me just say something about Euro parties. One thing I didn't mention in my talk, but was in one of her slides that had TISA with EPP, because one thing I didn't mention, with Orban getting kicked out of the center-right European People's Party, TISA joined, right? So TISA is in the EPP. And so then, of course, the biggest center-right faction in Europe, wanted him to win. But one of the interesting aspects of EU party politics is that Euro parties, these pan-European coalitions, are not allowed to directly fund member parties. That's actually illegal. So they can't kind of come in and give a lot of support. So the resources didn't come there. But I think in terms of what the EU learned, I'm kind of quite afraid that they didn't learn the right lessons. Because the center right doesn't want to admit, because it can't kind of say to itself, actually, Orban was our sort of creation, right? Or that we helped him for years. And I think that's the lesson they should learn. I'm afraid they won't learn that because, they just don't want to admit it.
In terms of resources, so especially early in the campaign, and I think throughout, one of the innovations of TISA was to do a lot of things, low resource activities. When Péter Magyar started to do his countrywide tours, one of the signature elements of this that he was on the back of a pickup truck for the first couple. There was not a lot of infrastructure. Even the sort of December 2024 ones that I went to, there was not a big stage. There was nothing like that at all. There was also they really focused on getting donations and had these sort of regime changer cards that people would sign up for, where they would donate monthly to the party. They definitely got the most donations for a party in the country. But of course, they still struggle with resource constraints. This is something that there's not a lot of sort of public information about, but there is an impression that a party likely also got some help, at least in terms of like discounted kind of loan of like materials for campaigns from businessmen in Hungary, but some that doesn't have to be documented. In general, the party was very careful because Fidesz has used party financing to go after opposition parties. So they're very careful to be clean, not accept foreign funding or corporate funding.
But I do think that's one of the areas where some more digging needs to be done. I'll be very curious, where exactly TISA's money came from.
Okay, Christoph, and maybe we should have people just quickly give a 10-second, this is who I am, this is my title. Christoph.
Right. I'm Christoph Crombé. I'm at the Europe Center. What I wondered about most before Sunday was what Orban would do in case he lost, whether he would use violence or contest the results. So my question then is how come he didn't do that? Or even going back a few months, how come Peter Magyar didn't end up in jail or falling out of a window or something like that?
I'll say something, maybe Hanna. I mean, I'll have to say, I have to admit, I was surprised. I thought Orban would put up more of a fight. He was saying in the run-up to the election that Magyar is funded by Ukraine. I thought he would contest the results, claim foreign interference. I didn't think he would resort to mass violence, but maybe encourage a bit of a January 6th, So I was surprised. I attribute it to the scale of the defeat was so crushing that I think it just became, it became very hard for him to do that, if it was at all close, I think he could have tried to challenge and contest. That's, I think, the main thing. And as to why no defenestration, whatever the word is, right? You get thrown out of a window. Look, electoral autocracies like Hungary, this is not Russia, right? There is a gradation. They don't use violence. They don't mass arrest the opposition. It's not even Turkey, right? It was sort of using legal tools and tricks and abusing state resources to tilt the playing field. And I think for all my criticism of the EU, I think part of what EU membership did for all the damage, being in the EU meant you kind of had to be more like Hungary, less like Belarus.
Yes, the only things I would add. So one, I think it was a huge loss. Two, I think it was important that the police and military were largely not on his side. This is what these two sort of big, defectors or public, these videos really made people understand, and maybe parts of the Orban regime too, that probably 90%, they claim in both videos that 90% of the police and 90% of the military are opposed to Orban. There is a huge dissatisfaction. So we just likely didn't even have the sort of coercive, violent arm of the state capable of violence. There are sort of speculations that he was thinking but failed to build up the infrastructure to be more repressive, that there was might have been some resistance within Fidesz as well. There was a law that he tried to pass earlier that would have sort of silenced criticism very effectively in sort of foreign agent law style, like in Russia, but there was pushback, and that got postponed. There's also likely false flag, almost surely false flag bomb explosive attempted attack on a pipe in Serbia that was carrying Russian energy gas to Hungary. This was likely orchestrated with the cooperation of the Serbian regime to boost support for Orban. And there are reports that there was resistance within Fidesz to have the same sort of explosive attempted attack, sort of these bags of explosive discovered around all these pipes in Hungary. This is not confirmed, but people speculate that he just simply did not have even the internal support. But I think the most decisive is the huge loss.
Okay, I'm now going to start grouping questions just so that you guys can get them. So I have Oren and then Maria together.
So I'm Oren, I'm a postdoc at CPRL. My question actually was sort of exactly on this, was kind of a question about why Orban was unable to exert control over security forces. You kind of already answered it, but I'm curious how dissent could develop. Why wasn't that a primary kind of motivation? Orban to do as it was in other cases of backsliding like Venezuela or Turkey. And then with respect to the EU, I'm also curious if other current EU members might move to play a spoiler role now, like Slovakia or something else. It's just going to sort of be a whack-a-mole game.
I would add Czech Republic too. Okay, don't answer that yet, please. Maria.
I'm Maria Friel, a research scholar here at CPRL. So thinking about the issue of governing after regime transition, so you told us the military isn't captured by Fidesz, but to what extent is the bureaucracy and local government captured? And you anticipate that will be an important challenge for their capacity to govern.
That's good. So in terms of the security forces, so part of this is and especially in the military, it seems to have been incredible mismanagement in the past few years. The head of the military was replaced, and it's like 2 years ago, with Saleh Bobrovnitsky, who's a man who's a businessman, so had no military experience. The previous leader was actually the first high-profile defector to TISA from Fidesz, so Romulus Rusinsendi, who was very popular in the military. And in the past 2 years, so there was this mismanagement, there was a lowering of like effective wages, then there was a whole host of these changes that did not that created a lot of dissatisfaction. And because Hungary was under an emergency, the sort of soldiers in the military were not allowed to resign. So apparently a lot of it came out in this sort of video. This was sort of these like closely guarded secrets. Some people didn't really have an idea of what was going on in the military very well, but it became clear that majority of people in the military were dissatisfied, and these sort of asks to leave the military were not being approved. So in terms of governing and bureaucracies and local governance, I think the bureaucracies will be the biggest challenge. These bureaucracies have been pegged by Fidesz sort of appointees, especially in the leadership level, but also below. There are reports of people who have left over the past 16 years because obviously the working conditions were not what they would be in democracy, and what they were a lot of times asked to do were not what you would like to be asked to do as sort of a I guess, self-respecting bureaucrat. So here, TISA says that they're willing to work with people who are not making the key decisions. It's very hard to see what this will look like. A lot of what Hungarians are thinking about now, and is that TISA has overcome a lot of these like organizational challenges, and there's some hope that they will be able to do the same. What will be important is that TISA has gathered a very competent leadership around itself. So as part of it in the last like half a year. So there are people with a lot of experience, a lot of international experience, who will be leading these ministries. But it's kind of remains to be seen what that will look like. In terms of local governments, in cities, there were more opposition local governments, a large opposition local government, especially in smaller places. This will be a big question, because even independent mayors were strong Fidesz supporters, and sort of were basically carrying out Fidesz's commands in terms of, and actually cooperated very closely with the party for vote buying and voter intimidation. And again, this is another question, Mike, I think, in what this will look like.
Okay, and just on the question of whether someone else might stand in as the kind of spoiler, new veto wielder, et cetera. I think in the short term, I doubt it. I mean, in the long term, the EU still has these same structural problems, that it's vulnerable to autocrats more than a full country would be, because of the veto, unanimity requirements in many sensitive areas, et cetera. Past couple of days, there's been talk about eliminating unanimity voting entirely. Like maybe this is the moment to do that. I don't think they're going to do that, right? But so long term, this could still be a problem. Short term, when I look at the potential kind of cast of characters, Babiš, Fico, I don't think any of them will be as bold, partly because of the lesson what happened to Orban, right? That's like a cautionary tale for them. They don't want to maybe stand out as much as he did. But also, they don't have the political protection. So Fico used to be in the socialists, but they kicked him out a year ago because he obviously didn't belong in there, right? And Babiš was in the Liberal Party, right? But now he's in the Orban's far-right party. So Orban, was in this unique position in the whole period when he developed this model, like I said, that he had the protection of the biggest party. None of these other guys have that. So I think for now, no one will be equal to what Orban had been doing.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to do groups of 3 now. Wish me luck. All right. And if your question honestly has been asked already, I'm going to ask, in the spirit of Hungary and Hungarians today, I'm going to ask you to be honest and say, it's okay, pass. All right, Iveta?
Yeah, thank you. Iveta Sergeyev, research affiliate here at CDRL. Hanna, on one of your slides, you have the results of this little survey of why people voted for opposition candidate. There's exactly 0% of people who said democracy. Why do you think is that? People just don't associate, authoritarianism with corruption. Yeah, what's your take on that?
All right, don't answer that yet, please. Hector?
Do you think he might be staging a comeback? Might have been that part of the calculus to say, let's accept these results and stage a comeback like Ortega in Nicaragua did when he allowed election?
voice from Venezuela and experience as a result. All right, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Sebastian, I'm a PhD candidate in politics.
Oh, okay.
And I'm really interested in the fact that Peter Magyar was a member of Fidesz in the past. Did he win despite that? Did he perhaps win because of that? Was that an asset for him, especially in rural areas? And could that have perhaps played a role in his ability to kind of reclaim patriotism because he had come from within the organization that had really monopolized the definition of Hungarian nation previously?
Answer?
Yeah, go.
I'll be real quick and then give you on the comeback. I think Orban might hope or think that or have hoped, but do I think it can happen? No, I think Orban's finished, right? We'll see. But I think, yeah, just the nature of the victory and everything we said, that might have been part of his calculus, but yeah, I think it won't work. And I mean, I'll leave the other questions really to Hanna, but I'll just say one thing on this last point. I do think it's more, we have to look at who is the Hungarian electorate. I mean, one thing about Magyar is just, yeah, that he was a conservative. He's campaigning in center-right. A lot of the previous opposition had been, these liberal parties, and I like them. I was friends with a bunch of these, MEPs and things. But yeah, is that a winning formula in Hungary? I don't think so. But anyway.
Yes. So the first, I'll just go by order. In terms of democracy, yes, I put it there just sort of, just as a reminder for us political scientists that people don't care about democracy as much as we do, especially the people who change their minds and end up voting for the opposition or voting for the first time. I think that's just a fact of the game. People care about corruption, and sometimes they think these sort of abuses of power that are facilitated by autocratization are corruption, but they will not think that I'm voting because I want to restore democracy. In terms of a comeback, I agree. It seems very unlikely to me as well. If anything, that could even be a disservice to Fidesz if Orban sticks around because of what a divisive figure he is, and how that could keep people from voting for Fidesz if it tries to reinvent itself or when it does. And in terms of Peter Magyar's background in Fidesz, so I think what people I've talked to sometimes would say, they mentioned it fairly rarely as a reason to support TISA, but one of the things that sometimes they highlighted was that he understood the regime. And I think that is actually true. And he understood how the regime played because he received all this information being inside the regime. His conservatism was important for getting voters. I think his background in Fidesz helped with that, but it was probably not absolutely necessary to convince people that he was a conservative. But I think there's sort of like this, maybe it's something that I would be interested to sort of understand a little bit better as well. One thing to note is that Peter Magyar's character was still somewhat divisive in Hungary. So people sometimes voted for the party despite what they thought of him. So there was like not that broad sort of, being enamored with Peter Magyar is really rare.
Okay, lightning round, last quick round. Hans, Jim, and gentleman on the screen there, whose name I don't know. Oh, okay, it's been asked. How wonderful of you. I want to know your name. Okay, Hans.
Know a little more about party, but does that mean that they lack political experience and still is that a concern?
Okay, before you jump into that, Jim.
The great Jim Goldberg, research affiliate here. Thanks to both of you. Dan, really appreciate your explaining how the EU enabled this. I was at a meeting in 2018, 2019 with those who had been leading Hungary in the early 90s, former prime minister, foreign minister, ambassador to US, people complaining about how could this happen, Hungary becoming an authoritarian state in the EU and NATO. And their response was, if we weren't in the EU and NATO, we'd have become a fully fascist state by now. So just curious your reaction.
Okay, I'll start with that one. Yeah, look, I've spent past, 7 years mostly writing about this stuff in Hungary, but you can view it, take a little longer view of history. My dad was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary who then escaped communism. So I think if he was alive now, he'd say, well, it's big improvement, right? Orban regime, right? And so, and I guess the point is, it was, like I said, it was a soft autocracy, right? They weren't doing, mass arrests. They weren't using violence really. And that I do think to the point of these people, I think whether what it would have become, I can't say for sure, but the EU put outer bounds on how far he would go. He wouldn't go to the Lukashenko or even to the Erdogan sort of moves. But the irony is that at the same time, while that did put outer bounds, right, the EU actually did support this regime. It didn't just tolerate it, it funded it, right? So yeah, it's kind of two sides of the coin, right? Because they put those outer bounds, but they made possible this form of autocracy. And I think looking to the future, that's what the EU needs to, think about and draw lessons, because he may have been the first autocrat of prime minister in the EU, but if we take a long-term view, he won't be the last unless they change things, right? There'll be someone else, right?
So very briefly on Hans's question. So the type of people who got elected, these are very much focused on sort of competence and local embeddedness. These are people without experience. The many speeches from Péter Magyar that I heard in these countrywide rallies, every time in the last, in this sort of election campaign, he had this line where he was like, well, these are people in your community. These are the doctors, these are the teachers, these are the small business owners who are like you and who have served this community with expertise. And they will now be standing for you, working for you in parliament. So they made this claim of competence and local sort of embeddedness and public service, but these are people without political experience. And TISA's sort of politicians in the EU and in the Budapest Local Council were all people without experience, and that has sort of generated obstacles in them being effective in these institutions. So that is again another thing we will have to see, and it's kind of people don't know.
Wow. Well, thank you both so much.